There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, tucked inside what appears to be loss, dressed in the plain clothing of disappointment. You accept what you are given, not because you believe it is enough, but because you have no more strength left to argue. You fold it away, carry it home, and try to find a use for something that no one else wanted. That is how Walter Voss came to own a spring. Not the land surrounding it, not the hills that rolled gently above it, not the old farmhouse her father had built with his own hands over the course of 3 years, hauling timber and stone up a slope that most men her age refused to climb anymore. She got the spring, a small rise of water that emerged from a limestone shelf at the eastern edge of the property, pooled briefly in a shallow basin ringed with moss and river stone, and then disappeared underground again before it reached any useful distance. It had no name on any map she had ever seen. It had no practical application that anyone in the county had ever managed to identify. When the attorney read the terms of the division aloud in that beige-carpeted office in November, her brother Denny had looked at the ceiling and pressed his lips together in a way that might have been sympathy or might have been guilt. Her sister Faye had not looked at her at all. The land had been their father's life. 63 acres of mixed terrain in a county most people drove through without stopping, good soil in the lower fields, limestone outcroppings on the east face, timber stands on the northern ridge that had never been fully logged out. Walter Voss had farmed portions of it, leased others, and spent the remainder of his years simply knowing it in the way that a person knows a place they have never left. He died in late September, a Tuesday, during a stretch of warm weather that made the whole thing feel slightly wrong, as if the season had not gotten the news yet. He left no formal instructions beyond the will, which was brief and, in some ways, deliberately vague. The attorney, a man named Gerhardt who had handled the family's paperwork for 2 decades, explained that Walter had divided the property into 3 roughly equal portions by acreage. Denny received the lower fields, some 18 acres of workable ground with an access road already cut through and a small equipment shed still in functional condition. Faye received the northern timber ridge and the meadow that bordered it, prime land for either a sale or a slow harvest, the kind of parcel that brokers talked about in terms of long-term yield. And Mara received the eastern quarter, some 11 acres of rocky slope, scrub brush, and what the will described, in her father's own handwriting, as the spring and the ground around it. The attorney cleared his throat after reading that line. He offered no additional commentary. Denny studied the ceiling. Faye looked at her phone. Mara looked at the window. She had spent 2 decades away from the property, first for college, then for a marriage that produced 1 daughter and eventually 1 divorce, then for the kind of slow, grinding work that follows both of those events and does not get easier as the years accumulate. She had been a bookkeeper, then an office manager, then something in between the two for a medical practice in a mid-sized city 4 hours south of the county line. She had been good at her work. She had been reliable, careful, the kind of person that organizations depended on without particularly noticing. When the practice was acquired by a larger group and the administrative staff was restructured, her position was eliminated in April, the same month her landlord informed her that the building had been sold and the rent on her apartment would increase by an amount that made the number on her last pay stub feel almost fictional. By the time she drove north for her father's funeral, she was 3 months behind on the car payment, $800 away from empty in her checking account, and carrying a suitcase that held more than she would have needed for a funeral if she had been honest with herself about how long she intended to stay. Her daughter, Lily, had just turned 11. She rode in the back seat with her headphones on and her knees pulled up against the seat ahead of her, watching the flat interstate give way to hills and then to the winding 2-lane roads that led toward the county. Mara watched her in the rearview mirror at intervals and thought about things she did not allow herself to say out loud. She thought about school enrollment deadlines and the cost of winter boots in a child size and whether her sister's guest room would remain available for 2 weeks or 4. She thought about her father's hands, the particular roughness of them, the way he had pressed her knuckles between his palms the last time she had visited and said something about the land being in her blood whether she remembered it or not. She had not known what he meant then. She had nodded in the way that children nod at parents who say things that sound more significant than convenient. And she had driven back south, and she had not returned until the September call came. The weeks following the funeral had the texture of suspension, time stretched thin over the work of closing out a life. There were accounts to settle and boxes to sort, and the particular sadness of folding away a person's daily things, the reading glasses still on the nightstand, the boots still positioned beside the back door with the same slight outward lean they had always had. Mara moved through the work steadily, which was the only speed she knew. When a meeting with Gerhardt finally took place, and the terms of the will were read and her portion of the property was described, she had not cried. She had not argued. She had gathered her copy of the documents into her bag and driven back to Faye's house and sat in the guest room on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the light. It was Lily who knocked on the door, eventually. She had brought crackers and a juice box from the kitchen, arranged on a small plate with the particular seriousness that 11-year-olds apply to gestures of comfort. She climbed up beside her mother and did not ask any questions. Mara put an arm around her and looked at the rectangle of orange streetlight on the carpet and thought, as she had been thinking for months, about the distance between where she was and where she had expected to be by now. The discussions about the division lasted several days. They were polite, in the way that family conversations are polite when the stakes are high and the relationships are old enough to carry the weight of things that have never been fully resolved. Denny's position was practical and delivered with the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed something and knows it. The lower fields had infrastructure, road access, proven soil. His agricultural contacts gave him a network to put the land to use. It made sense for him to have it. Faye's position was similarly structured. She had done research. She had spoken to timber consultants. The Northern Ridge had documented yield estimates that she could share if anyone wanted to look at the numbers. She had a long-term vision for the property that involved minimal disruption and maximum return. When they turned to Mara, she had nothing comparable to offer. She had a city apartment she was about to lose, a daughter enrolled in a school she was about to leave, and a financial situation that felt, on most days, like trying to read a map in a language she was still learning. She had no strategic vision for the Eastern Quarter. She did not know what a limestone spring was worth, if it was worth anything at all. She accepted the terms because the alternative was a legal process none of them could afford, and because some part of her recognized that her father had made a decision, and she was not prepared to argue with a man who was no longer present to explain himself. What she did not say, what she turned over in the guest room that night, and on the drive back south and in the weeks that followed, was the single question she could not resolve. Why had he given her that particular piece of ground? Walter Voss had not been a careless man. He had thought about things slowly and thoroughly, in a manner of someone who had spent most of his life working land that required patience and attention. He had never, in Mara's memory, made a gesture that did not mean something. The will was simple, and the division appeared unequal in almost any practical measure, and yet she could not make herself believe that he had simply forgotten her. She could not make herself believe that the spring was an afterthought. She carried that question south with her, and then north again in February, when she loaded the back of the car with everything that would fit and drove Lily up the county road toward the eastern quarter of the Voss land for the first time as its owner. The mobile home had been on the property for years, a single wide from the 1980s that had served as seasonal storage and occasional overnight shelter during the farm's more active period. Walter had kept it in functional condition in the way he kept most things, not comfortable, not modern, but structurally sound and weathertight. There was a wood stove and a propane line, still connected to a tank that registered about a third full, and a water line that had been winterized and could be reopened come spring. There was one bedroom and a narrow bunk built into an alcove that Lily immediately claimed as her own space, draping a blanket across the opening to approximate a wall. The first days had the quality of camping without the sense of choice that makes camping tolerable. It was cold. The wood stove heated the front 2/3 of the trailer adequately and left the back in a persistent chill that required an extra layer after dark. The nearest grocery store was 22 minutes away on a road that had one sharp curve Mara did not yet trust in low light. The school district enrollment process required 3 separate trips to an office that was only open on alternating Wednesdays. But Lily did not complain. She had her alcove and her books, and the singular dignity of a child who understands that the situation is serious without fully knowing why, and who decides, in that understanding, to be useful. She learned to carry wood. She learned to check the propane gauge. She helped Mara stack the boxes they had brought and asked, with genuine curiosity, if they could explore the property once the weather warmed. Mara told her yes. She told her soon. The money problem was not solved by the move. It was compressed by it, reduced from the kind of financial pressure that involves multiple overlapping obligations in an expensive city to a simpler and more manageable arithmetic of rural winter survival. The propane cost something. The groceries cost something. Lily's school supplies cost something. But the land itself cost nothing. There was no rent, no lease, no landlord who might call with news about ownership changes. The trailer was not graceful, but it was hers, and the 11 acres around it were hers, and that distinction mattered in a way she had not anticipated. It was the first time in several years that she did not feel the particular vulnerability of occupying a space that someone else controlled. She began going out to the spring in March, when the ground softened enough to walk the slope comfortably. The eastern quarter was rougher than she remembered from childhood, rockier and more densely brushed in the lower sections, with a limestone shelf emerging from the hillside in a series of uneven outcroppings that made the upper portion feel almost architectural, as if the earth had arranged itself according to some plan she could not yet read. The spring itself was smaller than she had expected. It rose from a narrow fissure in the rock, clear water moving with quiet persistence, pooling in the natural basin before disappearing into a cleft below the surface. The moss around it was thick and undisturbed, a deep green that made the surrounding stone look almost warm. She stood there the first morning and listened. The county road was far enough below that she could not hear it. The wind moved through the scrub brush with a sound like breathing. The water made almost no sound at all, just a faint pulse, barely audible, like something alive being careful about it. She brought her notebook that first morning, a habit from years of keeping accounts, and she wrote down what she observed the way she would have recorded inventory. The spring flowed at a consistent rate that she estimated by watching the water move across a measured section of the basin. The fissure it emerged from was roughly oval, about the width of her forearm at its widest point. The limestone around the opening was clean, not stained with the rust or algae she would have expected from a surface spring, which suggested the water was moving quickly from somewhere underground rather than pooling in shallow soil above. The basin retained maybe 8 inches of depth before the overflow disappeared through the lower cleft. None of this meant anything to her yet. She was a bookkeeper, not a geologist. She wrote it down because writing things down was how she thought, and because the spring was the only significant feature of the land she had been given, and she felt, without being able to justify the feeling, that she should understand it. She came back the next morning and the morning after that. She brought Lily on the 4th morning, a Saturday, and they crouched together at the edge of the basin and watched the water and talked about where it might come from and where it went. Lily asked whether there were fish in it. There were not, which Lily found disappointing. Mara told her that it meant the water was probably very cold and very clean, both of which were good things, even if they were inconvenient for fish. Lily considered this and decided it was acceptable. Mara began reading in the evenings. The county library was a 40-minute drive, but it had a reasonable collection of regional geology texts and, more usefully, an interlibrary loan system that allowed her to request more specific materials within a week. She read about limestone aquifer systems, about karst topography, about the way water moved through soluble rock over geological time, dissolving and reshaping the underground landscape in ways that were entirely invisible from the surface until you knew what to look for above it. She read about springs as indicators, about what a consistent flow rate suggested about the size of source system, about the difference between a surface seep and a true artesian emergence. She was not trained in any of this. She made mistakes in her reading, backtracked and reread, drew diagrams in her notebook that were probably wrong in their specifics, but helped her think. She asked the librarian, a patient older woman named Ruth, who seemed to find the inquiry genuinely interesting, for suggestions on who in the county might know about local water systems. Ruth wrote down 3 names on a slip of paper and mentioned that 2 of them were retired and might be willing to talk if approached respectfully. One of the names was a former state surveyor named Eldon Marsh, who had moved back to the county after his career ended and was known, according to Ruth, for having more knowledge about the subsurface geology of the region than anyone currently employed in any official capacity. Mara called the number on the slip of paper on a Tuesday evening and explained who she was and what she had found, and that she was not sure she was reading the signs correctly. Eldon Marsh was quiet for a moment after she finished describing the spring. Then he said he would drive out on Thursday if the weather was decent, and that she should not touch or disturb anything near the fissure before he came. She said she hadn't. He said good. He arrived Thursday in a truck that looked older than the trailer and more reliable than both of them. He was a tall man, somewhere in his 70s, with a careful way of moving over uneven ground that suggested long practice rather than caution. He did not say much on the walk up to the spring. He looked at the surrounding terrain more than the path ahead, pausing at intervals to examine the rock formations, pressing his palm flat against the limestone in certain places in a way that reminded Mara of a doctor listening to a chest. When they reached the spring, he crouched and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He brought out a small thermometer from his jacket pocket and held it in the flow, then recorded the reading in a small notebook he kept in the same pocket. He examined the fissure from multiple angles, lying flat on the rock at one point to look up into the opening from below. He pressed on the stone around the rim and listened, and whatever he heard or felt caused him to sit back on his heels and look at Mara with an expression she could not immediately interpret. He said, "How long has this water been flowing?" She said she did not know, as long as anyone could remember. He said, "Who told you this wasn't worth anything?" She said, "Everyone, more or less." He looked at the spring again. He looked at the hillside above it. He said that she should understand he was not in a position to tell her anything definitive without proper testing and mapping equipment, and that she should not get ahead of herself on the basis of one old man looking at one hole in the ground. But he also said that the flow rate, the water temperature, and the clarity of the emergence were all consistent with a deep system, a pressurized aquifer, the kind that sat below the surface limestone in pockets that could be, and he paused here and seemed to be choosing his words with some care, the kind of thing that sometimes turn out to be significant. Mara asked what significant meant. He said it depended on the size of the system. He said that the topography of the surrounding hillside, the pattern of the outcroppings, the way the water was emerging at this particular pressure from this particular fissure, all of it was consistent with a formation he had seen twice before in the county. He said both of those formations had turned out to contain very large amounts of water. She asked how large. He looked at the spring for another moment. Then he said that she should get a hydrogeological survey done, and that she should do it before she told anyone else what she was looking at, and that she should not be in a hurry to share this information with her siblings or anyone else connected to the property division. He said the last part with particular emphasis, looking at her steadily, making sure she understood. She understood. She drove him back to his truck in silence. Before he got out, he wrote down the name and number of a hydrologist he had worked with in the past, a woman at the state university whose fieldwork had focused on subsurface aquifer mapping in carbonate rock formations. He said to use his name when she called, and that he would tell the woman to expect to hear from her. That night, after Lily was asleep behind her blanket curtain, Mara sat at the small table in the trailer with a notebook open in front of her and looked at what she had written over the past several weeks. The spring's flow rate, the temperature of the water, the depth of the fissure, the name and number that Eldon had written in his careful, deliberate hand. She thought about her father pressing her knuckles between his palms. She thought about the land being in her blood. She thought about Denny looking at the ceiling. She thought about Faye and her timber consultants and her long-term yield estimates. She did not know yet what was under the hillside. She did not know what the hydrologist would find, or what the survey would reveal, or whether any of it would amount to something she could measure in terms that changed the arithmetic of her and Lily's life. She was still 3 months behind on the car payment. She was still the person who had been given the spring when everyone else took the good land. But she had written things down, which was how she thought. And she had called a number on a slip of paper, which was how she solved things. And she had been told by a man who chose his words carefully that she should not be in a hurry to tell anyone what she was looking at. That was enough for one night. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. Outside, the hillside was quiet in the way that rural places are quiet, layered silence, the absence of city noise revealing smaller sounds beneath it. Wind in the scrub brush, the faint pulse of the spring somewhere above in the dark. She lay in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, listening to the land. The hydrologist's name was Dr. Priya Anand, and she arrived on a Thursday morning in early April in a truck loaded with more equipment than Mara had expected. She had a graduate student with her, a young man who carried things without being asked and wrote notes without being told to. Dr. Anand herself was compact and precise in her movements, with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent a great deal of time working in conditions where efficiency was not optional. She shook Mara's hand, accepted a cup of coffee, and asked if she could see the spring before they talked about anything else. They walked up the slope in the early morning cool, Dr. Anand moving slightly ahead, her attention already pulling toward the limestone outcroppings in a way that reminded Mara of Eldon, but was sharper, more systematic. The graduate student lagged slightly, taking photographs of the terrain at intervals. When they reached the spring, Dr. Anand crouched and looked the same way Eldon had, but she also opened a tablet and called up a series of maps that Mara could not read from her angle. She spent some time looking between the maps and the landscape, turning slowly on the balls of her feet, orienting herself to something Mara could not yet see. She said, without looking up, "Eldon said you've been reading about karst aquifer systems." Mara said yes, though she acknowledged her reading had been largely introductory and probably contained errors. Dr. Anand said that was fine. She said the basics were not complicated. She said what mattered right now was that she take some measurements and do some preliminary testing before she said anything else, because she did not like to get ahead of the data. Mara said she understood. The testing took most of the day. Dr. Anand and the graduate student worked with a methodical quiet that Mara found reassuring, measuring flow, collecting water samples, running temperature profiles at different points along the hillside. At certain moments, Dr. Anand held a small device against the rock and watched a display Mara could not see. In the early afternoon, the graduate student began setting up what looked like a small seismic array, sensors pressed into the ground at regular intervals across the slope. Dr. Anand explained, briefly and without elaboration, that they were doing a ground-penetrating acoustic profile, that the tool was not perfectly precise, but would give them a rough picture of the subsurface structure. Mara sat on a flat section of limestone and waited. She had brought her notebook, but she did not write anything. She watched and thought. The county road was visible in fragments through the trees below. Twice during the afternoon, she saw Denny's truck pass, slowing slightly both times. He had not called her since February. He had sent one text at the beginning of March about a boundary marker he thought needed to be relocated. She had not responded. The question of whether he had noticed Dr. Anand's truck on the access road was something she put out of her mind and left there. By mid-afternoon, the acoustic profile was complete and Dr. Anand was looking at the results on her tablet with the graduate student at her shoulder. They spoke quietly between themselves in technical language Mara did not follow. At one point, Dr. Anand said something in a tone that seemed to indicate surprise, though she kept her expression controlled. The graduate student said something back. Dr. Anand zoomed in on one section of the display and was quiet for a long moment. She walked over to where Mara was sitting and held out the tablet so Mara could see the screen. The image was a cross-section, a vertical slice through the hillside rendered in colors and densities that meant little to Mara without context. But Dr. Anand traced a line on the screen with her finger, a contiguous region that ran from just below the spring's emergence, point downward and inward through the hillside, widening as it descended. She said the acoustic readings were consistent with a void space, meaning an open or partially open cavity in the limestone filled with water. The spring was not a seep or a surface accumulation. It was the visible tip of something considerably larger underground. Mara asked how large. Dr. Anand said that the acoustic profile was preliminary and could be wrong in its specifics. She said she would need to do a more thorough survey with better equipment, and that she would want to map the subsurface through a series of test points across the wider hillside before she committed to any interpretation. She said she did not want Mara to draw conclusions from one afternoon of field testing. Mara said she understood. Dr. Anand looked at the tablet again. Then she looked at Mara with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to it, a kind of measured professional excitement that she was visibly restraining. She said that, speaking purely off the record and as a preliminary impression, the void space suggested by the acoustic profile was considerably larger than the spring's surface behavior would indicate. She said that in her experience, formations of this apparent scale and depth in this type of limestone geology in this region were rare. She said the word rare with the particular emphasis of someone who means something more specific than the word usually carries. Mara said, "Rare how?" Dr. Anand looked at the tablet one more time. She said she would need the follow-up survey before she said anything else. She said Mara should not tell anyone about this conversation, not because there was anything certain to hide yet, but because preliminary findings had a way of being miscommunicated, and because once information began moving through informal channels, controlling the narrative became very difficult. She said Mara should trust the process and wait for the full results before drawing any conclusions or taking any actions based on the morning's work. Mara looked at the hillside. The spring moved at its same quiet pace, indifferent and persistent. She thought about her father's careful handwriting in the will, the spring and the ground around it. She thought about Faye's timber estimates and Denny's equipment shed and the way neither of them had met her eyes when Gerhardt read the terms of the division. She said she would wait for the full results. Dr. Anand nodded. She said she would be back within 3 weeks with additional equipment and 2 colleagues. She said Mara should continue not disturbing anything near the spring opening and should continue not discussing what she had seen today with anyone connected to the property. She said it the same way Eldon had said it, with that same particular directness, making sure Mara understood that this instruction was not incidental. Mara understood. After they left, she stood alone on the hillside until the sound of the truck had faded down the county road. The afternoon had shifted to early evening, the light going amber and long across the slope. The spring moved as it always had. The moss caught the color and held it. She thought about a word. Rare. She wrote in the notebook. She drew a box around it the way she boxed items in her accounts when they required follow-up, when they were too significant to leave unattended in the ordinary flow of figures. Then she walked down the slope to the trailer and made dinner for Lily and did not say anything about what had happened that day, because some things needed to be understood before they could be spoken, and because her daughter had already moved through enough instability that she did not deserve a version of hope that might not hold its shape. Walter Voss had learned, in the last several years, how to be patient about the truth. She had learned to wait for the numbers to come in before she spent them, to check the accounts before she changed her plans, to read everything twice before she let herself believe it. That discipline had not protected her from every loss, but it had taught her the difference between what looked like something and what actually was. She did not know yet what was under the hillside. She knew only what she had observed. The spring rose at a consistent rate from a fissure in the limestone. The water was cold and clean and moved with quiet persistence, and the ground around it had given a retired state surveyor reason to choose his words with care, and had made a hydrologist with 30 years of field experience use the word rare in a voice that was not quite steady. She knew one more thing, the thing she had been carrying since November. Her father had not made an accident of this. She was certain of it now, in the way that you can be certain of something a person meant when they're no longer available to explain it, when the only evidence you have is the shape of their silence and the weight of what they left behind. Walter Voss had walked this hillside for 40 years. He had watched this spring through 40 seasons. He had known this land the way he knew his own hands, every line of it, every texture, every behavior in rain and drought and frost. He had known what he was giving her. He had known, and he had kept it quiet because that was the kind of man he was. And he had put in her hands, not Denny's, not Faye's, And the only question now was whether she had the patience and the steadiness to do what he had evidently believed she could. She sat at the table with the notebook open after Lily went to sleep, and she wrote down everything from the day in careful order, the way she always wrote down things that mattered. Dr. Anand's preliminary observations, the acoustic profile, the description of a void space, the word rare. Then she wrote one more word beneath all of it, boxed it the same way, and looked at it for a long time. Underneath, the 3 weeks between Dr. Anand's first visit and her return were the longest Mara could remember since the weeks following the divorce, when time had a similar quality of suspension, of waiting for a verdict on something she had not chosen to put on trial. She went through the days with the same steadiness she always managed, taking Lily to school, working the 2 part-time bookkeeping clients she had found through a county business network, cooking dinner, checking the propane gauge, carrying wood. She went up to the spring each morning. Sometimes she brought the notebook. Sometimes she just stood there. She did not tell anyone. She had been given a clear instruction by 2 people whose judgment she had already decided to trust, and she followed it with the same discipline she applied to accounts. You did not move figures before they were confirmed. You did not spend money before it cleared. You did not speak a number aloud until you were certain it was real. She thought about what Dr. Anand had said. Void space. Rare. A formation of this apparent scale and depth. She thought about what lay below the hillside in the dark. Moving in pressurized silence through limestone, it had been dissolving and reshaping for longer than anyone alive could calculate. She thought about the spring, its patient emergence, its quiet daily announcement that something was down there and had been down there and would continue to be down there regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. She thought about her father walking this slope every morning for 40 years. He had paid attention. On the 14th day after Dr. Anand's first visit, Denny called. It was the first time he had called since before Christmas, and the fact of it alone told her something. His voice had the particular careful tone of a person who has been thinking about how to say something and has still not fully decided. He asked how she was settling in. He asked about Lily. He said something about the boundary marker again, the one from the text she had not answered, suggesting it might be worth both of them walking the line together sometime soon to make sure everything was squared away correctly. He said he had noticed some vehicles on the road near her access point a few weeks back. He said it as though it were incidental, a passing observation, something he had almost not mentioned. She said the vehicles had been friends of hers passing through. She said it evenly, without additional detail, and let the silence after it do its work. Denny said, well, good. He said she should let him know if she needed anything. He said the offer stood. She thanked him. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at the hillside through the trailer's small window. The morning light was doing what it did in April on north-facing slopes, arriving slowly and staying cautious, as if it was not yet fully committed to the season. She wrote down the conversation in the notebook. Date, time, what was said and what was not said. She did not know yet whether it mattered, but she had learned, in the years of keeping accounts, that the things that seemed incidental were sometimes the things that proved most significant in retrospect, and that recording something cost nothing, while failing to record it could cost considerably more. Faye called 4 days later. The conversation was shorter and more direct, which was consistent with Faye's general approach to things she considered inefficiencies. She said she had heard that Mara had someone out walking the eastern quarter. She said she wasn't prying, but given that the property division was still relatively recent and some of the boundary questions had not been fully resolved, it might be worth having a family conversation before anyone brought outside parties on any portion of the land. She said outside parties could complicate things. She said she was sure Mara understood. Mara said she did. She wrote that conversation down too. She had not told anyone about Dr. Anand. She had introduced her to no one locally. The truck that came up the access road had no university markings on it, and yet Denny had noticed vehicles, and Faye had heard that someone had been walking the property. The county was small. Rural counties had always had their own information systems, informal and comprehensive, operating through the same channels as everything else. The feed store counter, the diner, the hardware store, the slow triangulation of people who notice things and mention them to other people who also notice things. She had known this when she chose to say nothing. She had known that silence was not invisibility, only a delay. But she had also known that delay, properly managed, was enough. Dr. Anand returned on a Thursday, as promised, with 2 colleagues and a second truck carrying equipment Mara could not name. The colleagues were introduced briefly. One was a geophysicist whose work focused on subsurface water mapping. The other was a hydrochemist who would analyze the water samples in detail. They were both professional and quiet in the way that people are quiet when they're focused on something that interests them genuinely rather than merely professionally. They worked for 2 full days. The first day was methodical and largely ground-based, deploying sensors at a grid of points across the hillside, running the acoustic profiles in multiple directions and at multiple depths, taking additional water samples from the spring and from 3 shallow test points Dr. Anand had identified during her first visit. The second day involved equipment Mara did not fully understand, a resistivity survey that measured electrical conductivity through the ground to map the distribution of water and void space at varying depths. The geophysicist operated this equipment with a focus that was almost total, moving across the slope in slow, deliberate passes, his eyes on a display that Mara watched from a respectful distance without being able to read. Lily was at school during both days. Mara stayed on the hillside from early morning until the light failed, bringing water and food that she offered without comment, keeping herself useful and unobtrusive. She asked questions only when it seemed appropriate, which was rarely. What she could observe, she observed and wrote down. What she could not observe, she waited for. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Anand and her colleagues sat in the trailer around the small table with their laptops and tablets, cross-referencing their individual datasets. Mara made coffee. She sat on the edge of the built-in bench and did not push the conversation. She had spent 2 decades in rooms where other people were processing information that affected her, and she had learned that the most useful thing she could do in those moments was to be still and to be ready. Dr. Anand spoke first. She said she wanted to walk through what they had found, and that she wanted to do it carefully, because the findings were not simple and because she believed Mara deserved a thorough explanation rather than a summary. She said some of what she was going to say would be technical, and that she would try to translate as she went, and that Mara should feel free to stop her and ask for clarification at any point. Mara said she would. The spring, Dr. Anand explained, was the surface expression of a pressurized karst aquifer system. Karst referred to a type of landscape and subsurface geology formed when soluble bedrock, in this case limestone, was gradually dissolved by mildly acidic groundwater over very long periods. The result was a landscape that looked relatively ordinary at the surface, but was riddled underneath with channels, voids, and chambers of varying sizes through which water moved under pressure. The spring was not creating water. It was revealing it, the visible tip of a circulation system that had been functioning underground for potentially thousands of years. The acoustic and resistivity surveys had allowed them to map the approximate shape and extent of the void system beneath the hillside. She turned the tablet so Mara could see the composite image they had assembled. It looked nothing like what Mara had imagined. She had thought, without fully articulating it, of something like a large underground lake, a single open space below the rock. What the surveys revealed was more complex and more extensive than that. The system was not a single chamber, but a branching network of connected voids and channels, following the natural fracture lines of the limestone, descending from just below the surface at the spring's emergence point to depths that the surveys estimated at between 40 and 90 meters in different sections. The void space, meaning the aggregate volume of open and water-filled cavities within the mapped zone, was substantial. She said the word substantial with the same careful emphasis Dr. Anand seemed to apply to all her significant words, making sure it was understood as a technical term rather than a vague one. The hydrochemist spoke next. He said the water chemistry was consistent with a deep aquifer, meaning water that had been underground for a very long time, cycling through the limestone system at depth before emerging at the surface. The mineral profile, the isotopic ratios, the temperature at emergence, all of these were markers. He said the data suggested the source zone, the place where this water originated and began its underground journey, was likely several kilometers from the spring itself, somewhere to the northeast beneath the higher ground. He said that in his assessment the system was not merely large. It was, in the terminology of his field, a significant regional aquifer. Mara looked at the composite map on the tablet. She looked at the branching network of void space beneath the hillside she had been walking up every morning for 2 months. She said, carefully, "What does significant mean in terms of volume?" Dr. Anand and the hydrochemist looked at each other for a moment. Dr. Anand said that they needed to be cautious about specific figures at this stage, that the surveys gave them structural information rather than precise volumetric measurements, and that a full estimate would require additional drilling and testing. But she said that based on the mapped extent of the void system and the flow dynamics they had observed, the system was holding and cycling a volume of water that was, by any reasonable measure, very large. She said that aquifer systems of this type and scale, in this geological context, had significant potential value as water resources, particularly in the current regulatory and commercial environment around water rights and water supply infrastructure. Mara looked at the map. She said, "My father knew this land for 40 years. Dr. Anand looked at her. Mara said, "Is it possible he knew what was here?" Dr. Anand was quiet for a moment. She said it was possible. She said that a person with deep familiarity with the land, the behavior of the spring across seasons and drought years, the patterns of the limestone outcroppings, might have understood that the spring was not a minor feature even without formal geological training. She said farmers and ranchers in karst country often developed an intuitive understanding of their subsurface water systems through long observation, long enough to know when something was unusual, long enough to recognize that a spring that never failed, that maintained its flow rate through drought years when surface water vanished, was not an ordinary thing. She said a person who knew this land for 40 years would have had 40 years of watching that spring behave differently from every other water feature in the area. Mara wrote one line in the notebook. He knew. She drew a box around it. Dr. Anand said that she had spoken with a colleague in water resources law and that she wanted to make sure Mara understood certain things about the legal landscape before they went any further. She said that in this state, groundwater rights were a complex and actively contested area of law, and that the rights attached to a property over a significant aquifer system were potentially very valuable. But that value could only be realized if those rights were properly established, documented, and defended. She said that the moment information about a significant aquifer system became publicly known, it would attract attention from municipal water authorities, private water developers, agricultural interests, and potentially other landowners whose properties might sit above the same system. She said the word attention in the same careful way she said everything else. She said Mara needed legal counsel before she spoke to anyone else about what the surveys had found. She said she had a name if Mara wanted it. Someone who specialized in water rights and natural resource law and who had experience with exactly this type of situation. Mara said she wanted it. Dr. Anand wrote the name on a slip of paper and slid it across the table. That night, after the trucks had gone and Lily was asleep, Mara sat with the notebook open to the composite map she had sketched from memory, imprecise and probably wrong in its details, but enough to hold the shape of what she had seen. The branching network of void space beneath the hillside, the system that descended to 90 meters, the aquifer that had been circulating silently below the land her father had walked every day of his adult life. She thought about the will, the spring, and the ground around it. She thought about Gerhardt reading those words in his flat, professional voice, and Denny looking at the ceiling, and Faye looking at her phone, and herself looking at the window and folding the thing away because she had no more strength left to argue. She thought about what Dr. Anand had said about water rights, and about the moment information became publicly known, and about attention, and about municipal authorities and private developers and other landowners. She thought about 11 acres of rocky slope that no one had wanted, and about what was below it. Moving in the dark through limestone, it had been reshaping for 1,000 years. She thought for the first time in months about what it would feel like to not be afraid of the arithmetic. She did not let herself go further than that. The accounts were not confirmed yet. The figures had not cleared. She was still a person who checked the propane gauge and made dinners in a single-wide trailer and drove 22 minutes to the grocery store on a road with one sharp curve she still didn't fully trust in low light. She was still the person they had given the spring to when they took everything else. But she had learned something today that changed the shape of the problem, even if it did not yet change any of the practical facts. She wrote in the notebook, "Call the attorney in the morning." She underlined it twice and closed the notebook and went to sleep. The attorney's name was Clara Seath, and she drove up from the regional office on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks later in a car that was clean and unassuming in the way of someone who had learned that clients in rural counties responded better to discretion than to display. She was younger than Mara had expected, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the particular focused energy of a person who genuinely liked difficult problems. She reviewed the survey data and Dr. Anand's documentation before she came. She had prepared questions that indicated she had read everything carefully. They sat at the trailer's small table for 3 hours. Clara asked about the property division in detail, about the will's language, about whether the division had been legally finalized and recorded, about whether any of the boundary markers had been formally surveyed since the estate was settled. She asked about Mara's relationship with her siblings and about whether either of them had made any specific inquiries or overtures regarding the Eastern Quarter since the division. She asked about the phone calls from Denny and Faye, and Mara's notebook came out because she had written those conversations down, and the written record was more precise than memory. Clara looked at the notebook entries for a moment and said, without inflection, that it was good that Mara had documented those calls. Mara said she documented things as a habit. Clara said that was a useful habit to have. She then explained the legal landscape in terms that Mara followed carefully, asking for clarification where she needed it. In this state, the groundwater doctrine meant that subsurface water rights were attached to the surface land above, with certain limitations and exceptions that varied depending on the classification of the water source. A private aquifer system located primarily beneath a single property was generally treated differently from a regional system that crossed multiple property lines, and the legal status of the water rights depended significantly on which classification applied. The survey suggested a system that, while its source was northeast of the property, had its primary accessible emergence point on Mara's 11 acres. That was significant. The spring was not merely a decorative feature or a minor surface amenity. If the surveys held up under additional verification, it was the access point for a subsurface system of substantial size, and access rights to that system, in the current legal environment, had measurable commercial and municipal value. She said the word substantial and then, pausing, revised it. She said the word considerable. Mara asked her to be more specific. Clara said she was going to be careful here because the commercial value of water rights in large aquifer systems was not a simple calculation, and because the final figures depended on factors she could not yet determine, including the verified volumetric capacity of the system, the quality and consistency of the water under commercial testing standards, the regulatory environment at the time of any transaction, and the competitive interest from potential buyers. She said all of that needed to be properly established before anyone started putting specific numbers on paper. She said she had seen situations like this go several ways, and the outcomes varied enormously based on how the early stages were managed. Mara said she understood. She said, "What's the range you've seen in situations like this?" Clara looked at her for a moment. She seemed to be deciding something. Then she opened a folder and produced a single page, a brief summary of 3 prior cases she had handled involving significant karst aquifer systems. She placed it on the table and let Mara read it without comment. Mara read it. She read it again. The figures in the 3 cases range from $42 million at the low end of the spectrum, a smaller system with limited commercial application, to $312 million at the high end, a large regional aquifer that had attracted competitive bidding from 2 municipal water authorities and a private infrastructure consortium. She read those figures a 3rd time. She set the page down carefully on the table. She said, "And you think this system is comparable?" Clara said that she was not prepared to say that yet, and that she would be doing Mara a disservice if she encouraged expectations before the verification was complete. She said the surveys were preliminary, and that additional drilling and testing would be required to establish the verified capacity and quality of the system before any commercial process could begin. She said that process would take time and would require investment, and that Mara should understand the timeline realistically rather than urgently. But she also said, and she said it looking at Mara steadily in the way she had said certain things throughout the afternoon when she wanted to make sure they landed correctly, that the acoustic profiles and resistivity surveys Dr. Anand had shared with her were, in her experience, not the kind of data that pointed toward nothing. She said Mara should prepare herself for the possibility that the eastern quarter of the Voss land was not, in any practical sense, the lesser share of the inheritance. Mara looked at the window. The hillside was just visible above the tree-line in the late afternoon light. The spring was up there somewhere, invisible from here, moving in its quiet way through the rock. She said, "My father walked that hill for 40 years. Clara waited. Mara said, "He never mentioned it to anyone. Not my brother. Not my sister. He put in the will, and he never explained why." Clara said, "Some people protect things in silence." Mara looked at her. Clara said, "It doesn't always mean they don't intend for the protection to end." The weeks that followed had a different texture from the ones before. Something had shifted in the quality of the waiting, not because anything external had changed yet, but because Mara now understood the shape of what she was waiting for. The accounts were still not confirmed. The figures had still not cleared. But she knew what the figures might be, and that knowledge sat differently in the body than hope alone. She continued going to the spring each morning. She continued the bookkeeping work, the school runs, the grocery trips. She continued not saying anything to anyone who did not need to know. Clara had been explicit about this. The legal establishment of the water rights and the commercial process that would follow were both sensitive to timing and to the management of information, and premature disclosure would put Mara in a weaker position at precisely the moment she needed to be strongest. She understood. She had spent a working life managing accounts where the premature movement of figures caused cascading problems that were always harder to correct than they would have been to prevent. Denny called again in May. The careful tone was still there, but thinner now, the rehearsed quality of the earlier conversations replaced by something that sounded more like a person who had been doing their own research and was trying to figure out what they knew. He asked if she had done anything with the Eastern Quarter. He said he was asking because he had heard she might be in some kind of financial difficulty, and he wanted her to know that if she was considering selling the parcel, the family might want to have first right of refusal before it went to outside buyers. He said he was sure she understood the value of keeping the Voss land intact. Mara said she appreciated the thought. She ended the call and wrote in the notebook, and then called Clara's office and left a message. Clara called back within the hour. She said Denny's mention of first right of refusal was legally meaningless in the current context because the will had not included any such provision, and the property division had been finalized and recorded without any encumbrances of that kind. She said Mara had no obligation to offer her siblings any priority in any transaction related to the Eastern Quarter. She said the call was probably not accidental, meaning Denny had likely heard or sensed something and was attempting to establish a position before the situation clarified. She said Mara should continue not engaging. Mara continued not engaging. Faye appeared at the property in person in the second week of May, which was a different kind of escalation. She drove up the access road on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school and Mara was up at the spring. She called out from the bottom of the slope and waited, and Mara came down and met her at the flat ground near the trailer with the same measured calm she had been practicing for months. Faye said she had been thinking about the property division and whether it had been entirely fair. She said she was not accusing anyone of anything, and she was not looking to create conflict, but she had heard some things, and she thought it was worth having an honest conversation before things got complicated. She said she did not want to bring lawyers into the family. Mara said she appreciated Faye's concern. Faye said she had heard that there was some kind of geological survey done on the Eastern Quarter. Mara said that she had had some friends come out to walk the property, which was true in the sense that she now considered Dr. Anand a professional ally, if not precisely a friend. Faye looked at the hillside. Then she looked at Mara. She had the expression of someone who has spent a great deal of time being the smartest person in most rooms and is not entirely comfortable with uncertainty. She said that if there was something on Mara's portion of the land that affected the value of the overall property, then perhaps a conversation about the original division was worth having. Mara said she would keep that in mind. She watched Faye's car back down the access road and out of sight. Then she went inside the trailer and called Clara, who answered on the second ring because she had been expecting a call. Clara said the timing was getting interesting. She said that Denny's call and Faye's visit coming in close. Succession after months of limited contact suggested that information was moving through informal channels and that Mara's window for establishing her position without interference was not unlimited. She said she had been in contact with a water rights consultant who had additional connections in the regional municipal infrastructure world, and that she wanted to move to the next phase, the formal verification drilling that would convert the survey data into certified figures sooner rather than later. She said the drilling was an investment, and she outlined the cost, which was significant for someone in Mara's financial position, though not ruinous if structured correctly. Mara did the arithmetic in her head. She had been doing it for weeks, in fact, testing different arrangements of her available resources against the cost of the drilling, running the figures the way she ran every set of accounts. Honestly, without rounding things to feel better, facing the actual numbers rather than the ones she wished were there. She had a small reserve from the first few months of bookkeeping income, some emergency savings that she had not touched since the move, and the possibility of short-term loan against the property itself if the title remained clean enough to support one. She told Clara she would have the money ready within 3 weeks. Clara said that was enough time to arrange the drilling crew and the permitting, which she had already begun exploring in anticipation. Mara said, "You were expecting me to say yes." Clara said, "I was expecting you to have done the arithmetic already." Mara looked at the trailer window and the slope beyond it. She said, "My father never spent money before he knew what he was spending it on." Clara said, "What do you think he knew?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think he knew everything." The drilling crew arrived in the 3rd week of May. For people in a truck-mounted rig that came up the county road early on a Monday morning and drew, as such things did in rural counties, a certain amount of local attention that Mara could not prevent and had decided not to spend energy worrying about. They were experienced and efficient. Dr. Anand had recommended them specifically, and their previous work included aquifer verification projects of the type Clara had described in her 3 reference cases. They set up at the 2 primary test points that the acoustic surveys had indicated as optimal access locations, positions where the void system came closest to the surface and where drilling would give the most representative cross-section of the system's character. The first borehole took 2 days. The second took 3. During that time, Mara was present on the hillside each day, watching without hovering, available without being intrusive. She brought food. She answered questions about the terrain when asked. She wrote in the notebook. She did not show the notebook to anyone. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the lead driller, a man named Carver who had been in the profession for 23 years and had the particular unreactiveness of someone who had seen too many outcomes to be surprised by any one of them, came over to where Mara was sitting on the limestone shelf near the spring. He had a core sample in a clear tube, a section of what had come up from the second borehole, and he held it up so she could look at the rock in the bright afternoon light. The limestone was pale gray, almost white in places, shot through with darker veins, and in 2 distinct sections it was simply absent, replaced by air, by nothing, by the negative space of a void that the drill had passed through without resistance. He pointed to those sections. He said nothing elaborate. He simply pointed, letting the sample speak for itself. She looked at the sections of absence in the core. She looked at the hillside above the spring, at the pale limestone emerging from the earth in its uneven architectural way. She thought about a word. A number of words, actually, but one in particular. Underneath. She had written it in the notebook weeks ago and boxed it. She had looked at it many times since and thought about what it held. Now, looking at the core sample with its 2 clean sections of nothing, its evidence of the open world below the surface of the world she could see, The word took on a weight that it had not quite carried before. It was not a concept anymore. It was a fact. There was a world underneath. Her father had known about it, and he had put it in her hands. Carver took the core sample back to the truck. The drilling was almost done. The analysis would follow. Clara would have preliminary certified figures within 3 weeks, and whatever those figures said would determine the next phase of the process: the formal water rights establishment, the approach to potential buyers, the commercial conversation that Clara had been quietly positioning for since she had first reviewed Dr. Annan's surveys. Mara sat on the limestone shelf and looked at the spring. The water rose from the fissure with the same quiet consistency it always had, the same modest behavior, the same unhurried pace. Nothing about it announced what lay behind it. Nothing about it suggested that beneath the 11 acres of rocky slope that no one had wanted lay a system of pressurized water moving through carved limestone voids at depths that made the surface world feel thin and provisional. It had always been there. The spring had always been its announcement. 40 years of daily walks had been her father's conversation with it. She opened the notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote the date at the top the way she always did, and then she wrote a single line below it. She did not box it. She did not underline it. She just wrote it in her ordinary handwriting, the kind of handwriting produced by someone who has been keeping accounts for 20 years and has learned that the most significant figures do not need decoration to announce their importance. The line said, "The drilling is done." She closed the notebook and looked at the hillside for a while without writing anything else. The afternoon was going golden and long. The spring moved in its usual way. Somewhere far below the moss and the limestone and the pale gray rock that the drill had passed through, the water moved in the dark through passages that had been forming since long before anyone living had been alive to name them. She sat there until the light changed and the drilling crew had packed their equipment and the sound of the rig truck had faded down the county road. Then she walked down the slope and made dinner for Lily and answered her questions about school, and did not say anything about the core sample or the sections of nothing in the limestone or the words she had written on the fresh page of the notebook. There would be time for that. There would be a specific moment for that, and she would recognize it when it came, because she had learned over the past several months how to distinguish between things that needed to wait and things that needed to move, and this was still a thing that needed to wait. The certified figures had not come yet. The accounts had not cleared, but the drilling was done, and the absence of rock in those 2 clean sections of core was the clearest thing she had seen since the attorney had read the words of the will aloud in November. And what it said was plain and enormous, and almost too large to hold in an ordinary evening in a single wide trailer at the edge of 11 acres of rocky slope, in a county most people drove through without stopping. It said that her father had been right about everything. The certified report arrived on a Thursday morning in June, delivered to Clara's office by secure courier and forwarded to Mara as a password-protected document that she opened on the laptop at the trailer's small table while Lily was at school. She had been expecting it for 11 days. She had checked her email each morning with the same steadiness she applied to everything, not urgently, not anxiously, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone who knows that a thing is coming and intends to be ready for it when it does. The document was 47 pages. The cover page carried the name of the hydrogeological firm, the certification date, the property coordinates, and a classification designation in the upper right corner that Clara had told her to look for first, before reading anything else. The designation was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to Mara without the reference sheet Clara had sent alongside it. But when she cross-referenced the two, the classification resolved into a category she had memorized from her reading over the past 2 months. Class 1 Regional Aquifer System. Verified pressurized formation. Commercial and municipal grade. She read that line 3 times. Then she went to page 6, where the volumetric estimates were presented in a table with confidence intervals and methodology notes, and a row of figures that she examined with the same careful attention she gave to any set of accounts she was seeing for the first time. She did not rush the reading. She did not skip to the bottom line. She read the methodology first, then the confidence intervals, then the assumptions underlying the estimates, the way a responsible bookkeeper reads a balance sheet, understanding the structure before the total. By the time she reached the total, she had already understood the shape of it. She had read enough, over the preceding months, to know how to interpret what the preceding pages were telling her. She had done enough arithmetic in the margins of enough sleepless nights to have a rough sense of what the figures were pointing toward. And still, when she read the certified estimate of the system's commercial water rights value, the number on the page was larger than she had let herself fully prepare for. The certified range was $287 million on the conservative end, under assumptions of limited commercial development and a single buyer transaction, and $349 million on the upper end, under assumptions of competitive bidding from multiple municipal and private infrastructure buyers. The midpoint estimate, which the report designated as its primary reference figure for planning purposes, was $329 million. She read the midpoint figure once. She looked at the wall of the trailer. She looked at the window and the slope beyond it. She looked at the notebook on the table beside the laptop, closed, with its 2 months of careful entries inside. She looked at the figure again. $329 million. She did not cry. She did not make any sound. She sat very still at the small table in the single-wide trailer on 11 acres of rocky slope in a county most people drove through without stopping, and she held the number in her mind the way you hold a thing that is too large to fully grip, carefully, with both hands, aware that it is real and that setting it down carelessly would be a mistake. Then she picked up the phone and called Clara. Clara answered on the first ring. She said, "You've read it." Mara said yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to understand that the certified range is conservative by design. The methodology the firm uses is deliberately cautious, calibrated to hold up under legal scrutiny and contested valuation proceedings. The figures they produce are figures they can defend in court, which means they are not optimistic figures. They are reliable figures." Mara said she understood. Clara said, "The midpoint estimate of $329 million represents a real number in the current market for water rights of this classification and scale. It is not a projection or a speculation. It is a certified valuation based on verified physical data." Mara said she understood. Clara said, "How are you doing?" Mara looked at the window. She said, "I'm doing the same way I've been doing." Clara said, "That was good." She said that was exactly the right way to be doing. She said the next phase was going to require Mara to remain exactly that way, steady and patient and deliberate, for what might be several more months before any transaction was finalized and any fund were received. She said the commercial process was not fast, and that fast was not, in any case, what they were aiming for. They were aiming for optimal, and optimal required time and care. She said she had already been in preliminary contact with 4 potential buyers, 2 municipal water authorities in the region and 2 private infrastructure consortiums that had expressed interest in regional aquifer systems of this classification. She had shared only the classification designation and the general location parameters. No identifying information, no property details, nothing that would allow anyone to connect the opportunity to Mara Voss or the eastern quarter of the Voss land before the legal position was fully secured. She said the interest had been immediate and, in at least 2 cases, significant. She said she wanted to meet in person the following week to walk through the next steps in detail. Mara said she would be there. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a while. Outside, the morning was ordinary in the way that June mornings in rural counties are ordinary, bright and unhurried. The sounds of the property moving around the trailer in their familiar order. Wind in the scrub brush. Birds calling from the timber stand to the north, which was Faye's timber stand now, part of the long-term yield estimate that Faye had described in that careful voice in the attorney's office. The spring moving up there on the limestone shelf in its quiet way, announcing nothing. She thought about her father. She thought about 40 years of mornings on that hillside. 40 years of the spring behaving the way it always behaved, never failing in drought, never flooding in wet years, maintaining its steady, patient pace through every season. 40 years of a man who thought about things slowly and thoroughly observing that behavior and understanding what it meant without any geological training, understanding it the way farmers understand the land they have lived on long enough, through accumulated attention rather than formal knowledge. She thought about the way he had pressed her knuckles between his palms that last visit, the land being in her blood whether she remembered it or not. He had not been speaking generally. He had not been making a sentimental gesture. He had been telling her something specific, in the only language available to a man who had decided, for reasons she was only now beginning to fully understand, to protect what he knew in silence and pass it forward in the one way that could not be contested or redirected or managed by anyone else's convenience. He had put it in the will. He had put her name beside it. He had written the spring and the ground around it in his own handwriting and trusted that she would look at it long enough and carefully enough to understand that it was not a consolation. It was the inheritance. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below it, she wrote the certified midpoint figure. She looked at it for a long time without drawing a box around it, because this one did not need a box. This one was the number everything else had been pointing toward, the bottom of the account, the cleared figure, the one you wrote at the end, when all the entries above it had been properly verified and the column had been summed with confidence. She closed the notebook. She stood up from the table. She went outside and walked up the slope to the spring and stood at the edge of the basin and looked at the water moving in its quiet way through the fissure in the limestone. She said, out loud, to the hillside and the sky and the water and whatever remained of a man who had walked this ground every day of his adult life, "I found it, Dad." The hillside did not answer. The spring moved as it always had. The wind went through the scrub brush with a sound like breathing. That was enough. The commercial process unfolded over the months that followed with the particular deliberate pace that Clara had promised, each stage moving carefully into the next, the legal framework for the water rights established and recorded before any commercial contact became specific. The certified valuation shared with potential buyers only after non-disclosure agreements were signed and the terms of confidentiality were legally binding. Clara managed it with a precision that Mara recognized and respected, the kind of precision that comes from understanding that the value of a thing can be diminished as easily by the manner of its presentation as by any flaw in the thing itself. There were 4 buyers at the table by August: 2 municipal water authorities, a regional infrastructure consortium, and a private water development company that had been acquiring aquifer rights across the region for several years and had the resources and the motivation to move quickly. The competitive dynamic between them was, Clara explained, exactly what the certified range had assumed at its upper end. 4 serious buyers with overlapping but not identical needs, all looking at the same Class 1 regional aquifer system with commercial and municipal grade certification, all understanding that access rights to a pressurized water system of this scale and quality in this region were not a renewable resource. There would not be another one available when this transaction closed. The bidding was formal and structured, conducted through Clara's office according to a process that she had designed and that all parties had agreed to in advance. Mara was not present for most of it. Clara handled the communications and the negotiations, updating Mara at each significant juncture with the same careful clarity she had brought to every stage of the process. Mara received the updates, asked her questions, gave her instructions, and returned to the work of her days, the bookkeeping clients, the school runs, the dinners, the morning walks up to the spring. The spring itself had not changed. She had looked at it every morning since February, and it was the same water emerging from the same fissure at the same quiet pace. What had changed was her understanding of it, the way a word changes when you learn its full meaning, becoming not a different word but a deeper one, carrying more weight than it did before you knew. In the second week of September, Clara called and said that the bidding had reached its conclusion. The winning offer was $329 million, the exact midpoint figure from the certified report, not the conservative end, not the upper end, the precise center of the range that the hydrogeological firm had designated as its primary reference figure for planning purposes. Clara said, in her dry professional way, that it was unusual for an outcome to land exactly on the midpoint estimate. Mara said, "My father would have appreciated that." Clara said she thought that was probably right. The transaction closed in October. The legal transfer of the water rights was recorded. The funds were held in escrow according to the terms of the agreement and released to Mara's account on the date specified in the closing documents. A Tuesday in mid-October, an ordinary weekday, the same kind of day the letter about her father's death had arrived on the previous November, ordinary days having a way of being the ones that matter. She was at the small table in the trailer when the confirmation arrived. She looked at the number in her account for a long time. Then she called Clara and said thank you. Clara said it had been her privilege, and meant it in the way that people mean things they do not say lightly. Then Mara picked up Lily from school. Lily climbed into the back seat with her backpack and her book, and her knees pulled up against the seat ahead of her, the same position she had ridden in since they drove north in February, the posture of a child who had learned to make a compact space her own. She said school had been fine. She said her friend Jessie had gotten a new dog, and it was apparently very funny. She said they had talked about rivers in science class, and she had told the teacher about the spring, and the teacher had seemed genuinely interested, which Lily had found satisfying. Mara drove the county road toward the trailer, the one with the sharp curve she no longer worried about in low light because she had driven it enough times now to know it by feel. She said, "How would you feel about a bigger house?" Lily looked up from her book. She said, "Bigger than the trailer?" Mara said yes. Lily said, "How much bigger?" Mara said, "Considerably." Lily thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. She said, "Would I still have my own space?" Mara said she would have considerably more of her own space. Lily said, "Okay." She went back to her book. Then she looked up again and said, "Is something good happening?" Mara looked at the road ahead of her. She said, "Something very good is happening." Lily looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Is it because of the spring?" Mara looked at her in the rearview mirror. She said, "What made you think of that?" Lily said, "I don't know. You always look at it like it's important." Mara drove for a moment without speaking. Then she said yes. She said it was because of the spring. Lily nodded as though this confirmed something she had already worked out for herself. She said, "Grandpa knew, didn't he?" The county road went quiet around the car. The trees on either side moved in the October wind, yellow-edged, and started to let go. Mara said, "Yes, he knew." Lily seemed to consider this. She said, "He gave it to the right person." Mara kept her eyes on the road. She said, "I think so too." The calls from Denny and Faye came within 48 hours of each other, in the third week of October, when the transaction had closed and the recording of the water rights transfer had become part of the public legal record. Mara had known they would come. Clara had told her the recording would be accessible, that there was no way to prevent informed people from finding it if they looked, and that they should both assume that Denny and Faye, who had clearly been watching the Eastern Quarter with growing attention since May, would look. Denny called first. He did not use his careful tone this time. His voice was flat, with a particular quality she recognized as the sound of a person who has spent several days processing something and arrived on the other side of it not at peace, but at a kind of exhausted recognition. He said he had seen the public records. He said he understood now what the surveys had been about. He said he did not know what to say, which was the most honest thing he had said in any of their conversations since the will was read. Mara said she understood. He said he wanted her to know that if he had treated the division fairly, if he had thought about it the way their father had thought about it, things would have been different. She said she knew. He said he was sorry. He said it once, without qualification or explanation, which was the correct way to say it. She said she appreciated that. She said she hoped his fields were treating him well. She said she did not hold anything against him, which was true in the way that things are true when they have been examined from enough angles over enough time that the anger has been worn down to something quieter and more manageable. She did not tell him the figure. She did not tell him anything specific about the transaction. She thanked him for calling, and she said goodbye. She wrote the conversation in the notebook afterward, the last entry in a book that was almost full. Faye called 2 days later. The conversation was shorter and had a different quality. Not the flat exhaustion of Denny's call, but something more careful, more structured, as though Faye had prepared remarks and was delivering them in the order she had arranged them. She said she was happy for Mara. She said she hoped it worked out well. She said she had always believed the property division reflected what their father wanted, even if some of them had not fully understood at the time. Mara said that was probably right. Faye said she hoped they could move forward as a family. Mara said she hoped so too. There was a pause. Then Faye said, "How much was it?" Mara was quiet for a moment, not from calculation, not from cruelty, but from a simple fact that she was deciding in real time what the question deserved. She thought about the beige-carpeted office in November. She thought about Faye looking at her phone while Gerhardt read the terms of the will. She thought about the timber estimates and the long-term yield projections and the careful voice that had explained why the northern ridge was the more valuable parcel. She said enough. She ended the call. She looked at the notebook. The last entry was Denny's call. She turned to the final blank page and looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote one more line, not a figure, not a date, not an observation. Just one sentence that she had been carrying for 11 months without a place to put it. It said, "He gave it to the right person." She recognized the words as Lily's. She left them there. What happened in the months after the transaction closed had the quality of a long-held breath being released, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, one obligation at a time, one fear at a time, the arithmetic of Mara's life rewriting itself in a way that felt less like transformation and more like correction. Like a column of figures that had been off for years finally being reconciled to the right total. Not a new number, but the accurate one, the one that had always been true beneath the errors. The car payment was resolved first, which she acknowledged was not a significant gesture in any objective sense, but felt significant in a personal one, because the car payment had been the most persistent and concrete symbol of the financial gap she had been living in for 3 years. The monthly reminder that the distance between what she earned and what she owed was not closing. Closing, it felt like removing a stone from a shoe, not a transformation of the journey, but a restoration of the ability to walk it normally. The debts followed, methodically, the way she did everything, in order of interest rate and then in order of emotional weight, which were not always the same order, but which she balanced against each other as she went. Medical bills from a year before the move. The balance on the credit card she had carried since the divorce. A small loan from a friend in the city that she had not been able to repay and had thought about more often than she had ever said aloud. She bought a house. It was not far from the Eastern Quarter, a restored farmhouse on the county road with 4 proper bedrooms and a kitchen that had windows on 3 sides and a porch that faced east toward the hillside and the spring. Lily had her own room, a real one with a door that closed and a window that looked out over the yard and enough space for the things an 11-year-old needed space for. She decorated it herself, which took 3 full weeks and resulted in an arrangement that made complete sense to her and somewhat less to anyone else, which was entirely as it should be. Mara kept the 11 acres. She had no intention of giving them up. The water rights had been transferred, but the land itself remained hers. The surface and the limestone and the spring that emerged from the fissure in its quiet daily way. She went up to it most mornings, still from the new house now, a shorter walk across the meadow grass and up the slope. She brought the notebooks sometimes. Sometimes she brought Lily, who had taken to sitting at the edge of the basin and reading The Spring's Quiet. Background presence apparently conducive to concentration. She established a small bursary at the county community college in her father's name. Walter Voss had finished 8th grade before the farm had needed him full-time, and he had spent the remainder of his life reading everything he could get his hands on and never saying, or at least never saying to her, whether he regretted what education he had not received. The bursary was for students in agricultural sciences and geology, disciplines that seemed appropriate, and it was funded at a level that would persist for many years without drawing on anything she needed for herself or Lily. She called Ruth at the library, the patient older woman who had given her the slip of paper with Eldon's name on it, and she said thank you in terms that were specific enough that Ruth would understand what she was thanking her for, which turned out to be something Ruth had suspected but not confirmed. Because in a rural county, information moved through informal channels in both directions, and Ruth had heard things and drawn conclusions that turned out to be roughly accurate. She called Eldon. He was not the kind of man who said, "I told you so," which she had already known, but there was something in his voice during that call that she recognized as satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a person who trusted their own reading of the land and was not surprised to learn it had been correct. He said her father would be pleased. She said she thought that was probably right. They did not speak for very long, but the conversation was complete in the way that conversations are complete when both people understand what is being said underneath what is being said. She called Dr. Anand and thanked her in equally specific terms, and Dr. Anand responded with the same measure of precision she applied to everything, saying that it had been a genuinely interesting case and that the formation beneath the eastern quarter was, in fact, one of the most significant she had documented in 30 years of field work, and that she intended to write about it in a professional journal at some point. With Mara's permission. Mara gave her permission and said she hoped the paper was thorough, because the formation deserved to be properly documented. Dr. Anand said it would be. In November, on the anniversary of the letter that had arrived between advertisements and unpaid bills in an ordinary stack of mail, Mara drove to the county seat and visited the small cemetery where her father was buried. The grave was marked simply his name and dates and nothing else, because he had been a man who preferred function to decoration and had said so specifically when the subject arose. She brought nothing ceremonial. She stood at the stone for a while and looked at his name. She told him what had happened, quietly and in order, the way she would have told him anything, the surveys and Dr. Anand and Clara and the competitive bidding, and the figure that had landed on the midpoint estimate with a precision that Clara had called unusual and that Mara had called exactly right. She told him about Lily's room and the porch that faced east and the bursary at the college in his name. She told him about Denny's call and Faye's question and the word she had used in response. She told him that Lily had said he gave it to the right person. She told him she agreed. She stood there for a while longer. The November light was low and pale, the same color it had been the morning she drove north for the funeral, the same quality of light that belonged to that particular month in that particular county, thin and honest and unwilling to flatter anything it touched. She had not expected to find it comforting, and yet it was. She drove home on the county road. The curve that had made her cautious in February went by without her noticing it, because she knew it now, because she had driven it enough times that it was simply part of the road rather than an obstacle in it. The farmhouse appeared through the trees on the left, its east-facing porch catching the last of the afternoon light. Inside, Lily would be home from school, probably at the kitchen table, probably reading, probably with a snack she had assembled with the same earnest practicality she brought to most domestic tasks. Mara pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going in. She thought about the 11 months since the letter had arrived. She thought about the drive north with everything that would fit in the back of the car, the suitcase that held more than a funeral required, the child in the back seat with her headphones on and her knees drawn up. She thought about the single-wide trailer and the wood stove and the propane gauge and the 22-minute drive to the grocery store. She thought about sitting on the edge of a bed in a dark room without turning on the light, holding something that everyone agreed was worth nothing, trying to find a use for what no one else had wanted. She thought about how thin the distance was, in the end, between a thing that looks like nothing and a thing that is everything. How the difference was not in the thing itself, but in the willingness to look at it carefully enough and long enough to understand what it was saying. Her father had looked for 40 years. She had looked for 11 months. And the spring had been saying the same thing the entire time, in the only language water knows, which is the language of persistence, of moving through obstacles rather than stopping at them, of finding the fissure in the limestone and emerging from it into the light and continuing, regardless of who was watching or whether anyone understood what they were seeing. She got out of the car and went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table with a book and a bowl of crackers, which was, Mara thought, a kind of continuity, the same child who had brought crackers and a juice box to a dark room in November, who had climbed up beside her mother without asking questions, who had recognized that something was serious and decided to be useful rather than afraid. She looked up when Mara came in and said school was fine, and there was a thing on Thursday she needed to bring a note for. Mara said she would write the note. Lily went back to the book. Mara made tea and stood at the kitchen window that looked east toward the meadow and the slope and the limestone shelf where the spring emerged from the rock in its quiet daily way. The afternoon light was fading across the hillside. The scrub brush caught it and held it briefly before letting it go. She thought about the notebook, now filled entirely, sitting on the desk in the study. 47 pages of surveys, conversation records, boxed words, underlined figures, and one sentence in the handwriting of an 11-year-old that she had adopted as her own. She would need a new notebook. That was a good problem to have. She thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not in the legal sense. Not the transfer of title and the recording of documents and the certified figures in escrow, but in the older sense, the sense her father had understood when he pressed her knuckles between his palms and said the land was in her blood. To inherit something was to receive not only a thing, but a relationship with that thing, a history of attention and care that was being handed forward with the expectation that it would be continued. Her father had attended to that hillside for 40 years. He had understood it. He had protected it in silence and passed it forward in the only form that could not be redirected by anyone else's convenience. She had received it. She had done what he had trusted her to do with it. And now the spring was still there, still moving through the fissure in its quiet way, and the hillside was still hers, and the limestone was still limestone, and below it, in the pressurized dark, the water moved through channels that had been forming for 1,000 years, entirely indifferent to everything that had happened above it, and entirely unchanged by any of it, which was one of the things that Mara had come to find genuinely comforting about water. It did not require your understanding in order to persist. It persisted regardless. The understanding was a gift you gave yourself, if you were patient enough and attentive enough and willing to look at something long enough to see what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be at first glance. She had been patient. She had been attentive. She had looked. Outside, the hillside went dark in the particular order that hillsides go dark, top first and then descending, the light retreating from the limestone outcroppings and then from the scrub brush and then from the moss ring basin at the spring's edge. The spring itself was invisible now in the November evening, but it was there. It would be there in the morning, and she would walk up to it the way she had walked up to it every morning since February, not because it required anything of her, but because she wanted to, because her father had taught her, without meaning to and without saying so, that knowing a place was its own form of relationship, and that a relationship tended and maintained was a different thing entirely from one that was taken for granted, and that the difference between those two things was not visible from a distance, but was everything when you were close enough to see it clearly. Lily looked up from the table and said, "Mom, the tea." Mara looked at her hand. The kettle had been done for some time. She said, "Right." She poured the tea. She sat down across from Lily at the kitchen table in the house with the east-facing porch, in the county that most people drove through without stopping, on the edge of 11 acres of rocky slope that no one had wanted. She wrapped her hands around the mug. She was warm. There was a cardboard box in the equipment shed that she had not opened until spring. She had seen it during her first week on the property, pushed to the back of the shelf behind rusted hinges and a coil of irrigation line that had not been used in years. It was sealed with packing tape that had dried and curled at the edges, her father's handwriting on the top in permanent marker, the letters faded but legible. It said only Eastern Quarter. She had noted it and moved on, the way you move past things when there is more immediate work to be done, telling yourself you'll come back to it when there is time. She came back to it in April, a week after Dr. Anand's first visit, and then she sat down on the shed floor and did not move for a long time. Inside the box were her father's field notebooks. Not one, 11 of them, each labeled on the cover with a date range, the earliest beginning in the late 1970s and the latest ending in the year before his death. They were the kind of notebooks that farmers used before everything went digital, small and durable, their covers stiffened by weather and repeated handling, their pages dense with entries written in the same controlled hand she recognized from the will. He had used a mechanical pencil throughout, replacing the lead as it wore down, the early entries darker and the later ones lighter as his preferred lead grade shifted over time. She read them in order, starting with the earliest, sitting on the shed floor until her back required her to move to the flat rock outside, and then on the trailer steps when the light changed, and then at the kitchen table through the evening and into the following morning. Lily found her there at 6 a.m. with the third notebook open and the coffee cold beside her, and asked if she had slept. Mara said she had not. She said she was reading something important. Lily looked at the notebooks and said, without being told anything, "Are those Grandpa's?" Mara said yes. Lily poured herself cereal and sat across the table, and did not interrupt. The notebooks were not diaries. They contained no personal reflections, no emotional disclosures, no statements of intention or purpose. They were observation logs, methodical and spare, recording exactly what Eldon had said a man with 40 years on the same ground would record. Weather conditions, seasonal behavior of the spring, flow rate estimates made the same way Mara had made her first estimates, by watching the water move across a measured distance. Her father had done this at the same intervals across 4 decades, creating a data set that no formal study had ever captured, a longitudinal record of a karst spring's behavior through droughts and wet cycles, and the slow shift of the region's water table over time. He had noted the drought years most carefully. In the dry summer of 1988, when surface water across the county had either vanished or reduced to unreliable trickles, he had recorded the spring's daily flow rate without a single disruption. In a dry stretch in 1995 that Mara remembered vaguely as the summer the creek at the bottom of the property had gone amud, the spring had not changed. He had underlined the entry for that day, the only underlining she found in any of the 11 notebooks, and written a single note beside it in parentheses that said, "Consistent with pressurized source." He had not been guessing. He had been confirming, again and again, across 40 years of patient observation, what he had begun to suspect very early on. The spring was not fed by rainfall or surface accumulation. It was fed by something below, something that operated on a different and deeper logic, something that did not respond to surface conditions because it was not subject to them. She found his first notation of the pressurized source theory in the 3rd notebook, dating to the mid-1980s. He had written it as a question. If the source is pressurized, what is the extent of the system? He had not answered the question in that entry, or in the notebooks that followed. He had simply continued observing, continued recording, letting the data accumulate without forcing it to conclusions it could not yet support. He had the patience of someone who understood that certain answers required more time than a single season or a single decade, and who was prepared to wait. She thought about that patience. She had always understood her father as a practical man, a man of routine and discipline, and the kind of quiet, stubborn competence that kept a farm running across multiple generations of uncertain weather and uncertain markets. She had not known, until the notebooks, that he had also been conducting a private scientific inquiry for 40 years, without formal training, without institutional support, using only a mechanical pencil and a series of small notebooks, and the unchanging presence of the spring. She thought about what it had cost him to keep it quiet. He had known, or strongly suspected, what was under that hillside. He had known it for years, perhaps decades, before the end. And he had told no one, not her brother, not her sister, not any neighbor or buyer or county official who might have approached the property with interest. He had protected it in silence because he understood, with the same practical intelligence that ran everything else he did, that knowledge of that kind, disclosed too early or to the wrong person, would not benefit the person who deserved to benefit from it. He had waited for the right person to be ready, and then he had made his arrangement in the only binding form available to him, in a will, in his own handwriting, and he had trusted the rest to her. She kept the notebooks in the study of the new house, beside the filled-up notebook of her own, arranged in chronological order on a dedicated shelf. She considered them part of the property's documentation in the same way the certified survey and the water rights transfer were documentation. They were evidence of a different kind, not legal evidence, but personal evidence, the record of a man paying attention to his land with the consistency and care that most people reserve for things they love. The Municipal Water Authority broke ground on the access infrastructure in the following March, 14 months after the transaction had closed. They were building a pump station and a collection point at the lower edge of the eastern quarter, where the subsurface void system came closest to a viable extraction depth, and a pipeline that would run along the county road to the regional distribution network. It was a significant construction project by county standards, large enough to require permits and traffic management, and a crew of 20 that arrived in the early mornings and left before dark. Mara watched the groundbreaking from the east-facing porch. It was a clear morning, the kind that March sometimes produced in that county, cold and bright and specific, the light hitting everything at an angle that made ordinary things look considered. The machinery moved across the lower edge of the hillside with the unhurried efficiency of professionals doing work they knew well. She had been told, in the pre-construction briefing, that the surface extraction point would be placed to avoid disturbing the spring or the limestone outcroppings above it. The agreement included a preservation clause that she and Clara had insisted on, specifying that the spring's natural emergence point and the 20 meters of ground immediately surrounding it were to remain undisturbed in perpetuity. The Water Authority had accepted the clause without objection. Their interest was in the deep extraction, not the surface feature, and the surface feature had no bearing on their operational requirements. The spring would continue. She had made sure of that. Eldon came by during the second week of construction, unannounced, as was his way. He stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the machinery for a while without comment. Then he said the pump station's placement was sensible and that the geotechnical team had read the terrain correctly, which he said as a form of professional acknowledgement rather than a compliment, because Eldon distinguished between the two. He asked how the spring was behaving. She said it was unchanged. He nodded as though this was what he had expected, which it probably was. Before he left, he said something she had not expected. He said her father had called him once, a long time ago, when Mara would have been a teenager, to ask a question about karst hydrology. He said he had answered the question as well as he could, and that Walter had thanked him and not called again. He said he had wondered, for years afterward, why a man farming that particular piece of ground had wanted to know about pressurized aquifer systems, and that he had eventually concluded the answer was probably the obvious one. Mara looked at him. He said he knew what he had. He just needed to know what to call it. She looked at the hillside. The machinery moved across the lower edge in its patient way. She said, "Did you know when I called you? Did you already suspect?" Eldon thought about this with the deliberateness he brought to most things. He said he had had an idea. He said the name Voss, attached to a question about that particular piece of ground, had struck him as meaningful. He said he had come out to look because he had been curious for 30 years. He went back to his truck and drove down the county road, and Mara stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the hillside and thinking about the long, quiet chain of people who had known or suspected or guessed and had chosen, each for their own reasons, to handle the knowledge carefully. Dr. Annen's paper was published in the late autumn, in a peer-reviewed hydrogeological journal with a circulation that was narrow by popular standards and significant within its field. The paper documented the Voss Spring Formation, which was the name Dr. Annen had given the system in the absence of any prior official designation, and presented the acoustic and resistivity survey data alongside the certified borehole results and the volumetric estimates. The abstract described it as one of the most significant undocumented karst aquifer systems identified in the region in the past 4 decades. In the acknowledgments section, Dr. Annen thanked the landowner for access and cooperation, and noted that the discovery had been made possible by the sustained observation of the site over multiple decades by the previous owner, whose field records had provided a longitudinal data set of unusual completeness. She had asked Dr. Annen to include that. She had felt it was important that the record reflect who had actually done the primary work and for how long, and with what instruments, which were a mechanical pencil and 11 small notebooks and 40 years of mornings on a hillside. The first bursary recipients at the County Community College were announced in January, 2 students in agricultural sciences whose applications had been selected by a small committee that Mara had helped constitute, but did not sit on, because she had wanted the selections to be made by people better positioned to judge merit in those fields than she was. She attended the announcement, which was a modest event in the college's main building, and she shook the students' hands and did not say much, because the gesture was not about her. One of the students was a young woman from the eastern part of the county who was studying soil science and had written, in her application essay, about wanting to understand the ground she had grown up on. The other was a young man whose family had farmed the same land for 3 generations and who wanted to study hydrology. She shook his hand and said she thought that was a good thing to study. He said he had heard about the Voss Spring Formation in one of his classes and had been reading about it. She said that was where it had started for her too, reading about something she did not yet understand trying to learn the language of a place she had been given and did not yet know how to see. He looked at her with the particular attentiveness of someone who is young enough to still find the paths that led people to certain outcomes genuinely interesting. He said, "Did you know what it was when you first found it?" She said no. She said she had known only that it was there and that it had been there for a long time and that it mattered, and that the knowing had come later, slowly, the way most knowing came. He nodded. He said thank you. She drove home on the county road in the January dark, the curve going by without notice, the farmhouse lights visible through the bare trees from a quarter-mile away. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, the county dark and still around her. She thought about what her father had understood at the end of all those mornings, after all those notebooks, after 40 years of the same fissure in the same limestone and the same quiet water. She thought it was probably not about the money, which he had known was there without knowing the figure, and which had never been the point for him in any case. She thought it was about something simpler and more durable, about the satisfaction of understanding a place on its own terms, of learning its language through patience rather than force, of being the kind of person who could receive a thing quietly and tend it faithfully and trust that the right moment for it would eventually come. She got out of the car. The east-facing porch was lit, and through the kitchen window, she could see the light on and Lily moving around inside, probably making tea with the careful deliberateness she had recently begun to apply to that particular task, as though she had decided that making tea was something worth doing correctly. The hillside was dark. The spring was up there in the dark, moving through the fissure in its quiet way, unchanged by everything that had happened and everything that would happen, consistent with its pressurized source, patient as limestone, persistent as water. She went inside. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.